We also have the Conservative MP Nusrat Ghani, a former member of the Home Affairs Select Committee, to give us a perspective from Westminster. And in the middle, we have Glyn Williams, who was the Director General for Borders and Immigration Policy at the Home Office until, well, really just a few weeks ago. So without more ado, why don't you give us an overview for about 10 minutes or so, Tony, and then we'll have shorter responses from Rob in the US at the Technology Works, and from Nusrat and Glyn. Nusrat's going to have to go a little bit early. So we do also have, we have a lot of people who are not in the room. We've got a good turnout here, one of the best post-COVID turnouts we've had in the room, but we also have obviously a lot of people online. So when we come to discussion and questions, we will be able to hear from them too. So over to you, Tony.
Well, thank you, David. And first of all, thank you to the Policy Exchange for having me and for hosting this event. I've done a bit of work with the Policy Exchange since I retired, with David in particular. We've written a few things about the border, some of them quite controversial, I expect, and some of them very much ongoing. But I guess the first thing is, why write a book? And I think, firstly, I think we've all got a book in us. If we've got the time and the inclination to actually get down and get your head down and write it. It took me an awful long time to do it. But secondly, whenever I go out with anybody and talk to them about my career, they always say to me, Tony, you really ought to write a book, because you've got so many stories there that need to be recorded. And so it is really a journey, I suppose, of immigration and border control from the 70s right the way through to the current day. And there was a lot to say. I think the other thing probably to say is I expect I will probably be the last person now to have risen up through the ranks of the immigration service of the border force to the top job, because that's what happened in my day. You were an immigration officer, you were a chief, an inspector, an AD, a DD, and then you got to be the chief, right? And the chief was the chief. There were people above that. There were permanent secretaries and people. We never saw them. They were invisible to us. So it's changed now a lot. People bounce around Whitehall in different, civil servants will tell you, the way to get on really is to not stay in the same discipline the whole time, move around a lot, but I didn't. So I think I'm probably gonna be the last one that actually made it right the way through and stayed in that discipline of borders in its various manifestations for over 40 years. And I suppose that the other couple of big, really landmark issues was that I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who was Director of Ports of Entry in 2 different countries. And if that's not the case, I certainly am for times of terrorist attack, because I was Director of Ports of Entry in Canada, as Rob Bonner will testify, on an interchange programme with the Home Office when 9/11 happened, which was a watershed moment for border control. Because quite often a lot of people associate border control with immigration. This wasn't about immigration, this was about security, actually. And if you fast forward 5 years, I came back and I was Director of Ports of Entry in what was the Immigration Service when 7/7 happened, which was the worst terrorist attack in our history here. And that gave rise, or the birth of something called homegrown terrorism, where we realised it wasn't just people, it wasn't just immigrants crossing our border that we needed to watch out for. It was other people who may be our own nationals travelling across the border for nefarious purposes. And what were we doing about that? And was there anything we could do to mitigate that threat as well? And I suppose then it was inevitable they were going to put me in charge of border security for the Home Office for London 2012 Olympics. And that was really, we were operating London 2012 under a threat level of severe, which you will know means that a terrorist attack was highly likely. And it wasn't going to happen on our watch. And so a lot of us walked towards that problem, and I'm very proud of the time I spent working in the Home Office up to and during and after the London 2012 Olympics, because we managed to stay out of the newspapers. We managed to stay off of the television. The stories were about our magnificent Team GB winning gold medals, and it was a fabulous time. And that means success for a civil servant, actually. If you're not in the news, that's good news, because no news, usually, particularly in the business that I've been in, no news is good news. But it wasn't. My story, normally would have ended there after 40 plus years in the Home Office. I would have thought that would have been it, But actually, no sooner did I step out of the Home Office, the phone never stopped ringing. from that moment. And so I've even added a third part to the book, which a lot of the things that are going on have been going on since then. And there are people in the room that here now and people online that I've worked with since I retired. I'm hugely, hugely proud to be part of that alumni, including people like Lars, Shanker, Rob. You know, we've kind of stuck together. There is an alumni of us who believe we've still got a great deal to offer, even though we are no longer, Kevin as well, sorry, you know, who are no longer in public service. But we feel that we have such a depth and breadth of experience that we would like to at least make it available. And I've therefore been trying to say, Glyn, to come and join our throng, if you like, to help add weight, because I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned of history about some of the things that are going round actually have been round before, perhaps slightly differently. I did have a bit of an argument with a number of publishers about whether this was going to be an autobiography or political non-fiction. And they all wanted me to write political non-fiction. Some of them give me quite a lot of money to write political non-fiction, but I wasn't prepared to do that, and because my life and Borders have been the same thing. I've been in it for 50 years, and I really wanted to demonstrate how, as I came up through the ranks, how my own life, you know, was interwoven with this, without my trip to Canada and so on. So that's what it is. It is a sort of an autobiography, but with a good hint of, as David said, of social history. So what's in it? It's in 3 parts. I mean, the early years are very much about immigration, actually. And I did say that when I joined, it was the aliens branch of the Home Office in 1972. And my first job was to decide whether an alien who was in the country would be allowed to stay for a longer period, granting extensions or not, to students and others. And Commonwealth were completely different. In fact, it wasn't very long before I joined. We were waving through Commonwealth citizens at the UK border and refusing entry to aliens. And then after the 71 Act came into force, of course, that removed the concessions for Commonwealth people. And then fast forward another 20 years, and we were waving through European nationals. In fact, there was a point where we were literally waving through because of the Bangaman wave, where actually an EU commissioner said that you're not allowed to stop them because you're part of this single market EU now. You need to wave them through. And it wasn't until we pointed out it's quite easy to pick up a French identity card for 50 francs in Paris and hold it up, and it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, you'll get through, that we started to draw back a little bit from that and started examining documents and actually getting much more into the security side of the business. So the political, you know, the compass has swung from one way to the other over the years with our own history of our country, and I think that's going to carry on. Yeah, I did get a lot of work in the 80s and 90s about organised immigration crime. Crime does pay. Immigration rackets, forgery factories, marriage rackets, dodgy colleges, dealt with all of those, and clearly in the end it wasn't something that we could deal with in law enforcement. It needed a policy change actually to be able to stop some of the mischief that was going on back in those days. Community tensions, huge community tensions arose during my time about whether or not it's okay to go into a community, in some communities, and arrest somebody who's in the country illegally. I think that still exists in some countries. Now, even some senior police officers told me there were no-go areas where that could not happen. Ministers didn't like that at all. So there was a tension, really, between the political demand to show that you were enforcing immigration laws versus the community aspects of that, and managing and working with communities, which I know is a really big part of the job these days. And then, of course, the massive growth in asylum claims, which are very topical now, but we had a huge growth in asylum claims in the late 90s, around about the noughties. That's when we set up the juxtaposed controls. We put our border force into France. We put security into Calais. We had 100,000 asylum applications, including dependents, in 2002. We had something called tipping the balance. That was under the Blair government, actually. It was under the Labour government, where we were told we needed to get asylum intake below removals. And I worked on both sides of that fence to try and get asylum intake down and to deliver more asylum removals. That's when we got caught a cold, and we were called not fit for purpose by a famous Home Secretary because we dropped the ball on deporting criminals, because we were very busy deporting failed asylum seekers to hit the failed asylum target. And so we had a lot of problems there. In terms of the Home Office, was reorganised. We've been reorganised a lot of times. We became the Immigration Service and the Border and Immigration Agency, and then the UK Border Agency, and so it goes on. And there are constantly reshuffles going on around this area in the Home Office as we go forward today. I did want to just have a word about Rob and 7/7 and 9/11 because this man is an absolute legend if you're interested in border security. He was the first Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection. I learned so much for him during my attachment to Canada, and he will tell you himself about some of the problems we've got now with borders and security. Because we don't forget, when you are in that queue, it's not just about that your passport's valid or that you've got the right papers or the visa. There are security considerations in play all the time as people are moving around the world. That is to try and keep our communities safe, actually. That's the reason we do that. Very grateful to all of the commendations that I got, people who have read my book. Theresa May, absolutely fantastic Home Secretary in my book. Absolutely thoroughly enjoyed, worked with her every day near enough during the Olympics. I went on, as you know, to be Prime Minister. The rest is history. Mark Sedwell, who couldn't be here tonight, was going to come, but he's away, but former Perm Sec, went on to be the Cabinet Secretary, also a good friend of mine, kindly read my book, and then also to David and Rob and others who have kindly read it and given their thoughts on it. I think that's probably about it. I mean, I think that's probably my time up, David. You know what I like. I'll go on forever if you let me about border control. But there are copies of the book here, and I'll be delighted to speak to anybody afterwards if you'd like to talk to me about some of the stories in there. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks. Lots of things I'd like to come back to you on, but shall we go straight to Rob Bonner, and we can test whether it's working or not. Rob, are you there? Can you hear me? He's speaking, but we can't hear him. Do you need to unmute yourself? Okay. Well, Rob, we're gonna. I don't know whether you can hear me, but we're gonna hold you for a moment, and let's go next to Glyn.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was a DG in the Home Office. I retired just at Christmas, actually. One of the few DGs in the Home Office who managed to retire at a time of his own choosing, I think, on my own terms. But I joined an outfit called UK Visas in 2006, which at the time was a joint Home Office FCO outfit, doing, as the name implies, the UK Visa Service, run by one Mr. Mark Sedwell, who went on to greater things. And that's when I first came across Tony, who was working with one Brodie Clark, who had issues of his own a bit later on. And Tony is one of the people who kind of educated me. I come from the Department of Trade and Industry, which is, kind of Whitehall, Ivory Tower sort of department. And I come into immigration visas for no particular reason. And Tony helped me find my way through the complete maze and labyrinth of the Home Office and its ways. And it wasn't Border Force at the time, was it? It was Border Control or something like that. So I'm very grateful to Tony. I can only admire your resilience, your willpower to sit down and write a book. Excellent. I think, Tony, you wanted me to just talk a bit about kind of what's happened since you left the Home Office, which I think was in 2013. I mean, just in my, well, if you scroll back 10 years, we go back to the Theresa May era when we were reducing net migration to the tens of thousands, if you remember that. And okay, there was some dispute about whether that was a sensible target, but I think the idea that we should try and reduce numbers was quite well accepted. It was a coalition government and was, really effective at policy making, actually. Illegal migration was just considered to be a bad thing, full stop. We were developing the compliance environment. I don't think Her Majesty's opposition opposed what became the 2014 Immigration Act or the 2016 one, for example. And there was no asylum problem. Tony cleared that up with his tipping the balance. No one was crossing the channel in small boats. Border security was developing quite nicely with biometrics, fingerprints. We were introducing e-gates, modernising, etc. So looking back on that era, it feels like a sort of haven of good order, really. And since then, the Home Office has been subject to a number of really difficult external shocks. The first one was in 2015, the migration crisis, which we, as far as the UK was concerned, have some really difficult scenes around Calais solved by increasing the security there by working with France. And we also introduced the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, which was the first. People nowadays talk about safe and legal routes. That was the first big one that the Home Office ever did and was successful. 2016, of course, Brexit, the referendum, and we immediately then had to get into what do we do with all the EU citizens in the UK? As a matter of policy, how do we negotiate that with the EU, the withdrawal agreement, the citizens' rights chapter? I did that working for Ollie Robbins. And what do we do? How do we end European free movement? And what do we replace it with? And we've obviously replaced it with the points-based system. So that was a huge area of activity, which sort of came out of the blue, basically, but was then worked on intensively and planned and has gone quite well. But then we get to 2018 and we have Windrush, which was obviously a disaster reputationally for the Home Office and a sort of tragedy for some of the individuals concerned. And I think it's really at that point that the Home Office lost public confidence, and we were not given the benefits of the doubt, really, in anything that we said from there on in. You can see that today over Ukraine, for example. We were then in the midst of COVID, which necessitated lots of policy changes, lots of changes at the border, the interaction with health policy and border security. Detention was very difficult, returns were virtually impossible, and so on. We then, last year, we had the Afghanistan evacuation and the crisis in August around that. We ended up with thousands of people in hotels, and I'm pretty sure that the Home Secretary was determined that wasn't going to happen again over Ukraine. And obviously now we've got the Ukraine situation, which again has come around very suddenly and has led to some difficult challenges. But going on over the last 2 or 3 years has been the small boats challenge, which certainly in my last year in the Home Office must have occupied about 3/4 of my time. In theory, it was one little thing that I was doing. Just working all the time with France, all the kind of policy initiatives that were being thought about, the operational initiatives, the reception centres, the barracks in Kent, the attempts or policy around pushbacks at sea, the bill, the Nationality and Borders Bill still in ping pong, etc. And now, of course, the latest emanation of policy innovation, Rwanda, and that deal, which we can talk about. So, I mean, these, and I've left out lots of things like the Hong Kong B&O visa and the last autumn lorry drivers and visas for turkey slaughterers and God knows what. So there has been no stability whatsoever in the Home Office, policy-wise, for certainly the last 5 years. The Home Office is basically set up to deliver business as usual with a bit of policy change chucked in. What we've actually had is business as usual with like constant change, largely imposed from outside. I feel, and Nuss might have a view on this, I feel that the political narrative has become much more nuanced and complicated. 10 years ago, it was just a given that the British public was basically worried about immigration, and the answer to that was to reduce numbers and stop illegal immigration. Now, particularly since Windrush and Ukraine's another example, it's much more nuanced. People are talking much more about values, human rights, compassion, vulnerable people, etc. I think there's still a big debate to be had about the role of immigration in the economy of the UK, where for years we've talked about the brightest and the best being the kind of people we want to attract. actually really all the issues are at the low-skilled end, and now that we haven't got European free movement, what are we doing about that? Where do you place the cut-off? What do you do about all these lorry drivers and so on that we not to have? What's the role of immigration policy in levelling up? And so on. And of course, a major debate that is now playing out in real time about asylum. Illegal immigration and asylum, they're different things, but they kind of very often come together. And the fact that the asylum system, in its classic sense, isn't working, because nowadays, if somebody becomes a failed asylum seeker and they're from Iran or Iraq or Eritrea or Sudan or Somalia or Afghanistan or even, other countries I can name, you cannot return those people to those countries. Iran and Iraq, for example, do not accept to take back failed asylum seekers. They'll take back some foreign national offenders, but not failed asylum seekers, as a matter of national policy. So anybody coming in a small boat who's Iranian or Iraqi knows that they'll stick in an asylum application. They know that if it's refused, they're not going anywhere. That really, I think, is why the government has worked so hard to get the Rwanda deal done. I was involved in that. I should declare an interest. I went to Kigali in November to start those negotiations, and I hope the Home Office can make a success of that. Going forward, the Home Office really desperately needs some kind of stability in terms of policy and delivery options. One interesting thing about the Ukraine crisis and the visa schemes that have been, the two visa schemes that have been set up for me, is that for the first time, sort of a cross-section of the British public is seeing the British visa system in action and really doesn't like what it's seeing. And nowadays, obviously, everybody wants to go on their mobile phone, press a few buttons and get an instant response, and that isn't happening in the visa system, for better or worse. And the kind of there's a whole thing about expectation setting here, as well as Home Office competence and being able to sort of catch up. Should there be a Department for Immigration? Personally, I think there should. If it can be planned properly and resourced properly, I think it's far too big a subject now to simply, both in policy terms and delivery terms, to be a part of the Home Office. Can Border Force do both immigration and customs? When those two things were linked a few years ago, no one thought about customs because it was the EU did it all. It was a common EU competence. Does that still make sense? Should Border Force be linked back in with immigration enforcement? That's the plan in the Home Office, to sort of go back to the immigration service as was when Tony joined. That's a big thing. It probably, to me, makes sense. But there's all these kind of major structural questions, I think. Alexander Down is looking at Border Force. I don't know where he's going with that, but it's an important question that needs to be done properly. I'd better stop.
Good. Well, that was really helpful. Thank you. But just before going on to Nusrat, hold those kind of UK thoughts, because we're going to try and go back to Rob Bonner in the US. Rob.
David, can you hear me?
Just about, yeah. Can we turn up the volume?
Excellent.
I think we can turn up the volume this
I was expecting Murphy's Law to operate in full force today, or this evening, but perhaps we if you can hear me, let me just say I'm delighted to be here at the Policy Exchange, albeit virtually, and to be on this very distinguished panel to discuss Tony's new book. Tony and my paths have crossed any number of times on border issues, and I'm gratified that to see that Tony actually mentioned me a couple of times in his book. In fact, when Tony contacted me, I guess, I don't know, a month ago or whatever it was, I told him I had given his book, I'd already given it a Washington read. And Tony, I think, was somewhat puzzled. This was a Zoom call, if I remember, and asked me what a Washington read was. And I explained that's where you go directly to the index, you find your name, and you read only those pages. So But I want to assure Tony that I've done more than a Washington read of his book now. In fact, I have gone on Amazon to buy his book. So enjoy those royalties, if you will, Tony. I've been told the time for my remarks is limited, so let me make a few quick points. I've known Tony, I guess, at least 20 years since, as Tony mentioned, going back to right after 9/11, when for reasons I certainly didn't understand at the time, but he explains in his book, Tony was a director, one of the principal directors in advising one of the two principal Canadian border agencies. The U.S. border with Canada had just been shut down. I take responsibility for that because I did that at about 10:05 a.m., ordered essentially 100% inspections at our border with Canada, shut the border down almost immediately. And in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, I actually think that was my very first act as the commissioner of U.S. Customs. But as you can imagine, over the next several days, weeks, months, actually, we spent many hours and many meetings as part of the Smart Border Accords, discussing and then implementing a number of revolutionary initiatives, measures not only that assured better security against the terrorist threat for both Canada and the U.S., but made the U.S. mutual border with Canada more fluid. Actually, trade and travel actually moved faster across our border both ways than it had prior to 9/11. Tony, although a Brit, was a key part of creating the smarter border, using advanced technology, advanced electronic information on people and cargo shipments, using technology and biometrics. And he also was a first-hand observer of the U.S.-Canada border agencies eliminating the fragmentation of border functions and controls, primarily between immigration, customs, agriculture, and environmental inspection, and so forth, and merging all these functions and people into one single unified border agency called Customs and Border Protection. Canada paralleled our action by creating the CBSA. The U.S. did that essentially as part of the Homeland Security Act that was passed by our Congress in 2002. As I say, the Canadian government did something very similar shortly thereafter. And not too long thereafter, the UK created the UK Border Force. All were major changes as to how each nation reorganized and unified their border functions. Tony, of course, went on to become the head of the UK Border Force at a critical time and served his country with distinction. Tony is, by the way, viewed and is one of the foremost strategic thinkers regarding border controls and national policy. And so anyone interested in this area, Tony's book is to me, it's a must read. Let me just conclude by saying, or noting really, the continuing importance of national borders, particularly in the era of mass migration, where tens, hundreds of thousands, literally millions of migrants are attempting to illegally enter countries, certainly the United States and the UK, and essentially get ahead of the queue in both our nations. Fortunately, by the way, you have a body of water that's 21 miles wide between your nearest border with the continent. We have the Rio Grande River, and which sometimes has water in it, and the Sonoran Desert, which pose very little obstacle to illegal crossers, all of whom have paid, by the way, and are guided by human smuggling organizations that are based in Mexico. Most of the migration is coming from Central America everywhere else in the world into the U.S. But all these migrants, even those who are crossing the border and claiming asylum once they cross, are paying human smugglers about, on average of about 5,000 pounds per person. Currently, the U.S. Border Patrol is apprehending 7,000 persons daily at the U.S. border with Mexico. That means that we'll have well over 2 million migrants who cross illegally into the U.S. this year. And the loophole that they and the criminal smuggling organizations are exploiting is the weakness in the U.S. asylum laws and the lack of detention. Although well over 90% of the asylum claimants will ultimately be rejected through our asylum system, and an order of deportation will issue, these migrants are almost immediately, they're being almost immediately released upon crossing the U.S. border to travel to the interior of the United States, most of whom never to be seen or found, never to be found again. They were given a notice to appear and at a later date to process their asylum claim. But this document called a notice to appear has been accurately dubbed as a notice to disappear, because that's what usually happens. In the United Kingdom, you're also facing a wave of immigrants, many of whom are asserting asylum claims. Let me just say, all of you will be benefited by reading Tony's book, his thoughtful book on this, but all illegal crossers that come across a border, certainly the U.S. border, and I'll speak only for me here, they're not entitled to the country of choice. They're entitled to a safe country if, in fact, they have a reasonable fear of persecution for political or religious beliefs, but they're not entitled to use that under the guise of being economic migrants. And we need to deal with that. And I know the UK has at least, I applaud the UK for at least launching an effort to deal with this very serious problem of the abuse of the asylum system by not just the aliens who are moving across their border, but the illegal smuggling organizations who are raking in the money and exploiting the aliens to get them into the United States in particular, and possibly into the UK. So let me conclude my remarks there, and I'll be happy to stay around for a while if there are any questions on from the vantage point of the other side of the pond here. Thanks, David.
Great, thanks very much, Rob. Yeah, and stay there because we'll come back to you later. Nusrat.
Thank you. Rob said he sort of read the book. Can I just say, Tony, I've even tabbed the book, so I read it over Easter. So it looks like a heavy read, but please read it. It's very easy to read. Tony, I congratulate you on writing the book. I mean, you were in office when the threat was severe for such a long period of time. For you to have the time and the capacity to write down your experience is extraordinary. And I was going to say, I've never met Tony, but unfortunately, Glyn and I think we've met, and when Glyn to give evidence to the Select Committee, and it wasn't a pleasant experience, so I'm pleased you referred to me as Nurs and not Ms. Ghani this time, so hopefully we can work on better terms. So, Tony, thank you so much for writing the book, but I want to turn to, I think it's page 196, about the Home Office not being fit for purpose. I was hoping you were going to be a bit more punchy, and you weren't, unfortunately, only because I had to reflect, Glyn, when you gave evidence on, I think when you gave evidence on the work of the Home Office, and unfortunately had to reflect back what we wrote in 2015-16, and I'm afraid there are pages and pages when I would argue, contrary to what you said, the Home Office wasn't in good order. So we're looking at times it took to process applications, the time it took to deport people, the time it took to get families to reunite, the loss of data, and also foreign national offenders. So I would argue that there's been quite some time when many of us parliamentarians have been anxious about how the civil servants sort of deliver within the Home Office, let alone the pressure that the ministerial staff are under to constantly come and deliver at the dispatch box and then reflect the political mood of the day. So chapter 196, I went to that straight away and I thought you were far too polite. So I'd love to get some more detail out of you. And then the last chapter is important. It's about how you deal with people travelling on small boats, which obviously is the topic of the day across Westminster, because Rwanda becomes a part of that. I think it's interesting to note how my constituents in particular probably reflect those many in the country, the attitude to immigration and asylum has changed completely because of Ukraine. One could argue it should have changed over Syria, should have changed over Afghanistan. It's most definitely changed over Ukraine. And myself and my team spent most of our office either on the phone or standing in a queue trying to sort out Ukrainian visas, and people just don't understand why it takes the time it takes, because we're dealing with a number of issues here, which means that people's attitudes towards part of the policy of dealing with illegal migration now involves Rwanda. And I know that the Policy Exchange themselves have done a serious piece of work on this a while ago, offering up 2 plans, and one of them was potentially taking people to a third country to process them. I must say there is some anxiety within the Rwanda proposal who it actually focus is on, because if we're not focused on people's mode of transport to get here illegally, it doesn't just focus on the people smugglers, whereas I believe that there is absolute an appetite to deal with the people smugglers and stop those people travelling on those small boat journeys because of the lifestyle risk and the people smugglers and the money that they make. Tony, I was hoping you may have elaborated more when you were dealing with 9/11 and other terrorist activities and dealing with migration and people possibly even looking at homegrown terrorism and how you had to change the ideology within the Home Office to accept that. But I was hoping there may be a bit more. I wasn't sure that was too political for you, so you left that alone. And the second, Glyn, I hadn't realised that you were maybe early on involved in Rwanda being part of the parcel of the new border and nationalities bill. So I'll be intrigued to know what data that you had to hand to say that this was going to smash people smugglers and not, unfortunately, deliver just a small number of people going off to Rwanda, because the public now are convinced it's going to be a large number of illegal people travelling over here will be sent over to Rwanda. But I don't think that's going to be the case going forward, and that may be an expectation that will have to be managed by the government and then by the Home Office as well. It's difficult not to talk about the Home Office and not get too political, because it gets banged about constantly like a football. You want to talk about stability and having policies, but unfortunately it gets hijacked because mass migration is a big issue, and people want to come here, and we have difficulty in securing agreements with countries within Europe, which is why we've had to go as far as Rwanda. But look, it was a really easy read, so I suggest that you read it. I wish we'd had you come forward at the Select Committee and you would have been this honest. I wish Glen would have been this honest when he came in front of the Select Committee as he was now. Maybe the report that we wrote on recommendations may not have been so stern, but it's a very difficult topic to address. But there is an overwhelming feeling that we have to deal with illegal immigration. We have accepted over 180,000 people within that process, and we can't have another 30,000 travelling on small boats and seeing more pictures of lives being lost, all the people smugglers making all that money. It strikes me that we've never had Magnitsky-style sanctions on people smugglers, and why we've never got to that place. Because it's not just about incarcerating them, it should be about closing their movement and making sure they have no access to their assets as well, regardless of where they are in the world. And I wish we'd targeted and focused more on the people smugglers when dealing with illegal immigration. But I look forward to the debate.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Nusrat. So we will open it up in a few minutes to questions, both here in the room and also to our online audience. I would remind you, if you are listening online and you want to ask a question, you must raise your virtual hand. Yeah, I mean, look, as Nusrat was just saying, I mean, actually, it's not a very opinionated book. You're kind of, you know, the kind of civil service attitudes are deeply ingrained, and you don't want to mess too much with the kind of opinionated political stuff. But I mean, I think, you know, you're among friends here. You can speak openly. I mean, well, let's come back to the boats in a minute. But I mean, I mean, the other obvious, you know, big story that has had a huge impact, as Glyn was saying, on the attitude towards the Home Office in domestic politics has been Windrush, and you know, one of the standard explanations for that failure was this, you know, combination of the so-called hostile environment with these groups of people who'd arrived in the 1970s and had been granted the right to remain permanently, but without, it was felt at the time that papers and accreditation was not necessary. And it's often said that it was precisely the loss of people like you, the loss of people with the institutional memory, who would have known instantly that these people belong to that category, and therefore shouldn't have been subject to the attempts to remove them or harass them because it was perceived that they were here illegally. I mean, is that a sufficient explanation for what went wrong in the Windrush scandal?
Well, I was interested, Glyn said about immigration and having an immigration department, or, you know, being it is an area of expertise. And I always say, I see Lars and Kevin and the customs guys, I always defer to them when we get into some of the vagaries of rules of origin and customs declaration. Immigration is the same. You need to know your onions. You need to know your history. So a lot of those poor people, I suspect, who got disadvantaged because of Windrush, I or my colleagues may well have interviewed them in the 80s or the 90s because they quite often were arrested by the police for something, nothing to do with immigration, usually, and we had a team of immigration officers who were called out. That's what our job was. Look, we've got somebody here, he hasn't got a passport, he hasn't got any papers, he might or might not be illegal, can you come and talk to him? But because we knew our onions, we knew about the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, we knew nobody had landing cards before 1173. I couldn't believe when I watched aghast at that debate across the House about which party it was that tore up the landing. It didn't matter. There weren't any. And so we knew. What we didn't do, which perhaps with hindsight we might have done, is give them something to say you are here lawfully. That was not part of our brief. Our brief was simply to say to the police, no, there's no problem with this chap. You can prosecute him for the drugs or whatever he's done, you know, the theft, but there is no problem with his immigration because we knew. What happened was there was a huge exodus of immigration officers in the night, right up to the Olympics. But a lot of people took the Queen's shilling and left. There were what they called ventilation packages to civil servants because they wanted to actually save money. Actually, there was a big drive down on public, if you remember, at the time, with the Chancellor of the day who wanted to save money. That was all just before the Olympics. So there is no doubt in my mind that we have suffered from a loss of expertise in the world of immigration. And I don't think the training's very good. I've actually offered to go back into the Home Office to deliver training because I've got people around me now who are of my era who could probably help them a lot. And there's quite a lot in this book, actually, to tell you about how you could tell whether someone's legal or illegal in this country without looking on the computer. We didn't have any computers till the year 2000. We haven't got an entry-exit system, David, you know that. We wrote about this in the border audit. It's really quite difficult to establish immigration status. Where we went badly, badly wrong, it's not only, you know, when we introduced the hostile environment, we did not bring in a national identity strategy to accompany it. Now, I lived through America, Rob, I know about the green cards. I went to Canada, PR card was introduced when I was there. Everybody had something to show that they were legal. Right, if they were legal, because that's what they introduced. We could have done this in 2008. It's in the book. I recommended it. We brought out the biometric residence permit for foreign nationals who wanted to stay in the country. It was brilliant. Nice, just little card had a biometric on it. You couldn't mess around with this. You couldn't swap it with someone else. It was yours. And you could prove to your landlord, your employer, to Uncle Tom Cobley and all, this is who I am. This is my permission to be in the country. And I said, why don't we do that for the whole population? Now, and have a register. And that was thrown out in 2010 when the coalition government came in and said, no, we're not going to have a national identity. And then we went and created the hostile environment and said to landlords and employers, well, you've got to check their papers when some of them haven't even got papers. And that was, I mean, and I tell you what, you know, we had enforcement targets in my time. I got a bonus for illegal working operations. It was a target to raid, you know, illegal working was not allowed in this place or that place. Tony Smith said, right, we're not going to tolerate illegal working here, there or anywhere, all over the place. And certainly for, you know, clamping down on employers was a big, big policy of the government today, that you will only hire people if you can show that they've got permission to work. Well, of course, employers, how would they know? Some of these bits of paper that were, you know, Home Office stamps from the 1980s, unless you'd been in the Home Office, you wouldn't even know whether that was a genuine or a forged one. And I said in the book, I got myself into a lot of trouble on a couple of occasions because I saw this as quite clear. You're either lawful or unlawful. When you get into politics, you're not actually. It all depends on a lot of other factors. And so, you know, I think I've been quite frank about that bit in the book, about actually how it works. What I would say, though, David, is, look, you know, I take my hats off to the Border Force. I'm one of them. And, you know, I'm hoping some of them are actually watching this. And some take comfort because, you know, Glyn talked about, you know, I thought I had it time, but, you know, you've had Brexit, you've had COVID, you've had migrant boats, you've had a triple whammy in the last 3 years in the Border Force. You know, they get beaten up. No one ever says thank you to a Border Force officer, ever. it just doesn't happen. So you know you're not. So you've got to have that camaraderie. You've got to have that spirit, esprit de corps that they have. But it's been severely, severely dented. If we want people to protect our border, and we want the best border in the world, we're going to have to start thinking about the people that we employ and giving them a little bit more support than the beating up that they get all the time now. People say, why do I do all this media stuff? It's for them. I don't get paid for that. I don't do it because I've got some political extra. I do it for the officers on the ground because I know what it's like. I know how they feel.
Quick follow-up on...
I think it's actually quite powerful what Tony just said about the lack of expertise and experience and the fact that you're prepared to go in and offer your insight to make sure that people in positions of huge authority now are going to be up to scratch. And I think that is one of the biggest issues that we have. You have no time to plan because we're lurching from one crisis to another. And we don't even get over the previous crisis. And I'm still trying to get Afghans out of Afghanistan. And so now my team are now dealing with Ukrainians. We haven't even sorted out the Afghanistan issue before we move on to the Ukrainian. And you always think each time the system will get better and improve, just get sharper. But it doesn't have time to do that. And a lot of it will be down to the fact that we haven't got people with good experience who remember how bad it was the last time we dealt with the crisis to then end up dealing with this. But look, the Ukrainian issue, because we have so many members of the public involved, this is now also going to be a hit to the Home Office again because their confidence will be dented. Because obviously every family in my constituency that wants to bring a Ukrainian over thinks they're the right sort of people to bring over and they want them prioritising over here weeks ago and they just don't understand what it's like for everybody in normal circumstances.
Can I just come, just one quick point while you're still here. The problem sometimes is when you bring in a new scheme like that or a new system like that, you're likely to get it wrong one way or another. So if you're going to have people going into people's homes, which is great, because people are really want to help people, what happens when that person gets placed a vulnerable person gets placed with the wrong family? Because you didn't actually do your homework on that family and you haven't done the back, and something awful happens. Who's going to be held accountable for that?
Tony, you're going to love my community meetings, but that's because that's what I raise all the time. We have to make the checks. We have to make sure that these homes, that these places are viable. We don't want to move people around in a small, over a very small period of time, weeks by weeks by weeks. But what's extraordinary is for most of the British public, it's the first time they've had to really work with a service. Yeah. And then now they realise actually it's always been pretty robust. And now we're expecting to bring over a substantial number of people. And this then completely is in a very different place to dealing with the issue of Rwanda that's now come up. And it's not about Rwanda as a country, it's how do we deal with illegal immigration. People have to rethink what they think is an illegal or an illegal immigrant, which may not sit right with where it is on the political spectrum.
Glyn, any thoughts on Windrush, the Home Office's reputation and so on?
Well, I wish we could, rewind and avoid that crisis. But I mean, it's an interesting point about ID cards. I mean, French and Belgians always said to me, "Oh, it's because you don't have ID cards." But if you required everybody in the UK to go out and get an ID card, those people who'd been affected by Windrush would have had to have come into contact with the Home Office and persuaded the Home Office of their status. And what actually went wrong on Windrush is the people who were encountered and who were then asked to demonstrate they had a right to be in the UK were not able to do so. So I think you would have had that issue coming up even if we'd gone, if the Labour government ID card scheme had been pursued. The issue for the Home Office was what evidence are you asking these people to provide? And the thing here is that sorry, just to get technical for a second, in 1988, the law was on indefinite leave to remain. So all these people were given indefinite leave to remain in 1971, 72, 73. They changed the law in 1988, which said, if you're out of the UK for more than 2 years, you lose your ILR status. So the test was, okay, you're telling me you've been in the UK for 30 years, 40 years. I'm sorry, you're going to have to demonstrate to me you've been continuously resident in the UK. You've got to account for any gaps in your residence. And that's what they couldn't do. And so the Home Office had to apply that law. And what happened on Windrush is as soon as it blew up, the minister said, hang on, we need to sort this out. The Home Office then adopted a more understanding approach to the treatment of the evidence. And that's what was really needed from the outset. And the Home Office wasn't in that mode. The Home Office was in the mode of, well, prove it. The onus, burden of proof, you know, border force, burden of proof is on the migrant.
Okay, thanks, Nusrat. Nusrat's got to go. We'll come back to. I want to come back to boats and illegal entry in a minute, but let's take a few questions from people here and online. Have we still got Rob Bonner?
No, he's left. It says that.
He's had to go. Questions, gentleman at the front here.
Good evening, everyone. Is the mic on?
Yeah. Can you say who you are, what organisation you're from?
Next. Right. My name is Peter Hogan. I'm here primarily to photograph Tony's book launch, but also I bring another perspective to this meeting, because from 1980 to 1999, I was an immigration officer at Heathrow. And I can bring another perspective in that, from 1980 to 1999, I felt I was in an organisation where anticipation was actively discouraged so as to preserve the joy of hindsight, and that when things went terribly right or terribly wrong, it was because of a snakes and ladders and alignment of loopholes. After my retirement, I married a Ugandan girl, and I found myself in the unique position of being arrested at 6:30 in the morning, and then de-arrested by 7:45, because I'd married this girl. It was a complicated case, and the snakes and ladders element has gone. It's now and as Tony might be able to confirm from the Facebook group that we patronise, that it's now algorithms that just direct you into cul-de-sacs. I'm not the only person who's seething at the way things are being handled, and many of my retired colleagues who've stayed in the field are banging their heads against the wall when they're helping people with visa applications, let alone Ukraine.
Okay, let's to be fair, we've had one here. Let's go online. We have a question from Andrew Armour. Andrew, are you there? Can you unmute and introduce yourself? No? Well, let's come back here. Yeah, a guy there with a tie on.
Thank you. I'm Douglas Tweddle. I was the Director Customs when the Border Force was created, and had some involvement with Tony at that time. And I think we very successfully transferred several thousand customs staff into what was then the Border Agency. The only concern I had then, which I still share, and immigration and security are hugely important issues, but border controls is about more than that. And there are things going across borders which we either want to get in or don't want to get in. And I just wonder if the emphasis on the control of goods has gone. And I think the other point I would say, any border control is giving a customer service and facilitating the legitimate. And when I see stories of several hours of British people trying to get into their own country, I wonder if we've got the emphasis right on facilitating the legitimate and giving a proper customer service.
Thank you. We're going to try one more time with Andrew Armour. If you are there, speak.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can now, yep.
Hi, good evening. Fascinating discussion. Very simple question. Which countries provide the best benchmark for fair and effective border control and immigration that the panel has seen?
Good short question. Let me just to bring the conversation back to illegal entry and boats and so on. I mean, in some ways, the boats problem has almost sort of done us a favour in that it's drawn attention to a kind of unavoidable hypocrisy in asylum management that affect all rich countries. I mean, we all make an absolute offer of the right to claim asylum that we know we cannot honour because so many the way that the rules have been liberalised over recent decades mean that there are, you know, as Charles Clarke put it, you know, 10, 15 years ago, there are literally hundreds of millions of people. You don't have to talk about economic migrants. Hundreds of millions of people could quite legitimately claim asylum in this country, which means that we make it as damn difficult as possible for people to come here to claim asylum. I mean, there is this massive hypocrisy at the heart of the system. And I mean, I think the only answer is ultimately to stop that that illegal entry right. And I just wonder though whether I mean, if offshore processing at Rwanda or somewhere else might be a way of cutting it off, but then surely it has to be. Well, first of all, there's the question of whether that is really feasible, whether it's possible to stop more than a small trickle of people coming in illegally. But also, and I think this is where the government have perhaps rather sort of failed to produce a kind of quid pro quo. I mean, we are going to take this very hard draconian line on stopping illegal entry, and no country can really allow, you know, 50,000, 60,000 people to come across the channel on boats every year. I mean, it's just not feasible. But they then have to kind of make a quid pro quo offer and have to say, right, well, we're going to take in 35, 40, 50,000 people through legal routes, through turbocharging resettlement schemes, through sponsorship schemes like we've seen with Ukraine. I mean, we haven't really heard that side of the story. I mean, do you think we should be having more of that sort of, you know, we're going to be absolutely draconian on illegal entry because it's just a form of queue jumping, but we are going to have a, you know, serious number of people coming in, asylum seekers coming in through legal and safe routes.
Can we go for it?
Well, I think first, in terms of making the Rwandan deal work, I mean, the Home Office is going to have to get people onto planes and get them to Rwanda, and obviously people are going to try and launch legal challenges at the point the Home Office tries to put them on a plane, on, for example, grounds that my ECHR right not to have degrading and inhuman treatment is going to be infringed. So the Home Office is going to have to demonstrate that the treatment they are likely to get and then do actually get in Rwanda is of the required standard. And the Home Office would have to come up with some kind of rationale for choosing certain people and not others to put on that plane. So those are difficult things that the Home Office is going to have to do. I think it will start slowly, and then they've got to get over those hurdles. And then we've got to see what actually happens in Rwanda and try and escalate the numbers. Because it's only once the numbers become material that people will think twice about coming. I mean, that's what the government is aiming, that this is, there's no point in me paying £5,000 to this people smuggler because I might find myself in Rwanda.
Yeah.
If they don't, and for that thought process to actually happen, it's got to be seen to be.
And it's got to apply to pretty well everybody, or pretty well everybody who's not here with them.
It's not going to apply to everybody. I mean, the Home Office, 28,000 people last year, plus another 15,000 who claimed asylum coming through other means. The Home Office isn't going to be shipping 20 or 30 or 40,000. Well, I don't think so. I mean, I'm not privy to all the details, but I would have thought it's going to be hundreds, maybe thousands, but not tens of thousands.
And how are they going to stop people absconding when they're in this?
In Rwanda?
No, in the camp in North Yorkshire. I mean, they're not going to be imprisoned while they're here, so they can just leave. Why would you wait to be shipped off to Rwanda?
Well, I don't know what the detail. I mean, you could detain people who you're seeking to remove. I don't know what arrangements are going to be made on that. But people abscond all the time, and then it's up to the Home Office to try and go out and find them and bring them round.
What are your thoughts on?
Well, I want to just pick up on some of the things that.
The other questions.
Well, I think people deserve a, as they tuned. I mean, I think first thing, borders are two-way streets now. It was a one-way street in my day. I mean, I send a book. I just serve a paper on someone who turned up at my border. They went straight back. I didn't have to ask permission from the country they came from. Now I do. The reason we got the problem on the English Channel is because French won't play ball. they won't have a readmission agreement, nor will the EU. They won't take them back. And so people say, well, as Glyn said, all you've got to do is get in this boat, £5,000, get to the UK, that's it. You won't come back to France and you won't be removed to wherever you're from, right? That's the problem the government's got, because the border's a two-way street. I just want to say about the customs stuff, because actually, you know what, we did take the customs over in some of it for the front line, which I thought was a good idea at the time because of what Rob Bonner was saying. Because actually bad people bring bad stuff, and I was all about security. But I worked in the Home Office. The Home Office is about security. It is about immigration. It's not about customs. We didn't do, and Kevin talked to you all day about this, HMRC still keep the policy lead for customs. Customs made a massive comeback now since Brexit. Huge comeback. We're all over this. There's guys here working with me on this because we have not got the bandwidth in the Home Office to do customs. So the question is, how are we going to, we've been talking about this, how are we going to set up a government that can actually do customs post-Brexit and do all the security and all the immigration stuff? And I think we're on another merry-go-round there. I wanted to just say about immigration, and, you know, I really sympathise with you, and I've heard so many stories like that, because it is an absolute personal nightmare if you get caught up in something like that with people. That is a symptom of the way we've set things up. So I think that's, but immigration, public opinion turns on a sixpence. Turns on an absolute sixpence on immigration. I remember I was actually live on Sky News when the migrant crisis was going on in 2015. I was actually on camera. And then that boy, Aiden, the boy that was found, the boy was carried by the, do you remember the picture?
Alan Kurdi.
Kurdi. That's in my book. Actually, they were doing a poll, and the poll just went like that, completely the other way. You know, the first 5 minutes of the interview is, we've got to stop all this. We can't have these migrants all coming over here. Why? What are we doing? Why don't we get them all over here now? What do we? It is a really, really politically emotive subject, immigration. You won't find a more political hot potato than immigration control, and so it is hard to navigate for officials. I just wanted to say the last thing is the question online about, you know, best border in the world. I mean, we have got a border strategy here, and we said, the government has said, we will have the best border in the world in 2025. And people often ask me, you know, as I've been in this business, who has got the best border? Look, you're not comparing like we like, Dave. You apples and oranges, you know. I'd pick Australia, right? I mean, it's miles from anywhere. You can only get there by plane. It's surrounded by crocodiles. I mean, if you want to try a border that you actually can control, you pick that. You wouldn't pick the US with a, you know, with a 5,000-mile land border with a third country, or even the UK, Europe. So, you know, there's lots, but I mean, I won't get into the fundamental principles of border management, because there is an art to this. There is science to this. There is training to this that we work on, that we can offer to people. But I haven't got time to go into it, but there are measurements. And we're not bad, but we have been hit hard, very, very hard by some of the things Glyn's spoken about earlier on, about some of the things that happened in Home Office the last 2 or 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, that we do really need some stability, and then we've got a chance. Thanks.
What about, I mean, you know, if we are going to open up more legal routes, I mean, how would that be managed? I mean, okay, so you can select more people from resettlement camps, you know, Afghans, Syrians, wherever the next crisis is. I mean, could you would you do this through the UNHCR? I mean, how would it work? You know, if you set a target, we're going to have 40,000, 50,000, you know, vulnerable people, you know, who need asylum. We're going to have 40 or 50,000 a year. How would you organise it?
Well, the Syrian scheme was run through UNHCR, who they determined someone to be a refugee who were outside the UK in a camp in Lebanon or wherever, and then they made arrangements with us, and the Home Office made arrangements with local authorities to accommodate them and integrate them in the UK, and that all worked pretty successfully. But that wasn't emergency relief in the sense, like, these people had already left Syria, were in camps. The Afghan and Iraqi schemes were for those who'd assisted the British Armed Forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it was the MOD who were determining on the spot who was eligible according to the sort of rules that were being set. Ukraine is a different thing again, isn't it? It's an there's an extension of the family reunion visa to include a wider pool than the normal family.
Is that something we could do? I think Canada has sponsorship schemes, about 10 or 15,000 a year, that seem to work relatively well. And it gets over integration problems.
Yeah.
It sort of partially gets over security problems.
Yeah, but I just think, though, that any visa scheme is not an emergency relief scheme. And as soon as the government decided it was going to run a visa scheme, it was inevitable that it would take time. I mean, the Hong Kong B&O scheme, for example, that took weeks, months to define the rules, to train the staff, to communicate, to set up the IT. You know, the Ukraine thing is being done on the hoof. I'm sure it could have been better done, and I'm sure that not everything the Home Office has done has been brilliant. But, you know, family reunion visas, so if you want to bring a spouse or a partner to the UK, for example, we've been doing, the Home Office is doing about 50,000 visas globally for that. The Ukrainian thing, I think they've already done, is it 30,000 or something? So if you're sitting in the Home Office, you're thinking, crikey, these are quite big numbers that we've done in like 2 months. And then there's a question about what is a good number? I mean, you just mentioned 30,000. Is that a good number? Is it 100,000? Is it 300,000?
Well, I mean, the current number, I mean, we're now granting asylum to about 45,000, 50,000 people a year, but the vast majority of them have come in illegally, and over half came in on boats. And if we're saying we cannot have that any longer, then we kind of, you know, we have some obligation perhaps to replace that number, but through people who we have selected through various.
I think that's where ministers would want to get to, that you've stopped so-called spontaneous asylum, where people are just coming across and sort of jumping the queue, and you then set up routes. But how to stop those who are not on those routes coming? Because at the moment, they're just jumping in boats and coming.
Anyway, perhaps a couple more questions. Guy at the back with a beard.
Hi, thank you. Andrew Connolly, journalist. I'm just wondering, what queue are these people supposed to be jumping? I mean, if we're asking what should replace the channel crossings, then by nature, you know, there is nothing. I mean, how does an Iranian join a queue to claim asylum outside of the UK territory? What about joint processing centres? It doesn't have to be in France. It can be more upstream in Greece and Turkey and so on. Has that been attempted? And if not, why not? Should it be? And then just one thing on the Rwanda policy. Glyn, the Israelis, I believe, tried a similar plan a few years ago, where they shipped out their unwanted to Rwanda, and I think almost no one stayed, and the majority of people who were sent to Rwanda left by smugglers back to Europe. I was wondering what's the safeguarding in place to make sure that doesn't happen this time.
Well, on that last side, I was in on the early stage. I don't know what the details of the final agreement are, but obviously in Rwanda, they're not going to be in detention or in prison. They will be able to have an asylum. If they want to make an asylum claim in Rwanda, they'll be able to do that. Why don't they do that? Well, they're claiming in the UK they're being discriminated against in Iran or Iraq, and they want safe haven. They can pursue that claim in Rwanda and stay in Rwanda. That's up to them. If they want to leave Rwanda, they can leave Rwanda. I mean, just being sort of a bit polemical about it, what claim have these people got on the UK?
Family.
Well, yeah, but you're confusing family reunion and asylum. There are family reunion routes, but if you don't qualify for the route, you don't qualify. You can't gate crash it by just coming and.
But that would be one of the possible, if we're going to say nobody can come in and claim asylum illegally, and we're opening up various legal routes. I mean, some of them already exist. I mean, I think about 180,000 people have come in legally over the last 20 years through asylum routes. We've had resettlement recently. We got sponsorship, and sponsorship would often be family-based, wouldn't it? I mean, you would expand that in the way that we have in the Ukraine crisis. I mean, it's not, that should be pretty easy to manage. And then you have a target. You have 40,000 a year target. So.
I think we're in danger of conflating two different problems. I think what we've got is a problem of human smuggling across the English Channel. between two safe third countries being fueled by human smugglers, people drowning, and it's organised crime. And actually, they haven't got a fear of persecution in France. They're not fleeing a war in France. We've got a global, there is no doubt we've got a global problem on refugees, no doubt at all. There's over 80 million now people displaced, either in their own country or close to their own country. The world needs to wake up to the 80 million, certainly not just the UK, but the world needs to wake up to those. But I think the way to do that is actually in that country or very close to that country, because you would normally expect people like, for example, from Ukraine are going into Poland. They're not coming directly to the UK. It does require international collaboration, and I think we have been behind the curve on that. But I do think we need to understand the distinction between people that are crossing borders between safe countries, and that's what the government's intention is behind the new bill, is to say that actually under Article 31, all you're obliged to do is not send somebody back to a country they fear persecution from. So therefore, you could send them back to France if the French would agree to it, or you could send them to any other country they pass through if that country would agree to it. And it seems to me that they found a country that will agree to it, which is Rwanda. They don't fear persecution in Rwanda either. They might not want to go there. And we talk about, you know, I went over to Dover to Calais with a BBC Kent crew just before Christmas, and we'd found an Iranian chap who we interviewed him on the beach actually with a camera crew, and he left Iran 15 years ago. And he was claiming asylum. So I want to go to the UK to claim asylum. So, well, what are you worried about? You haven't been to Iran for 15 years. He said, no, I went to Malaysia for a while, didn't like it there, went to Germany, got refused a visa, got in a boat to Italy. The guy had been travelling around Europe. He just wanted to come to the UK, really. And he honestly thought the message had got through to him from his friends here, this is the way to get into the UK. Just pay someone some money and go down to the beach and they'll put you in a boat. He wasn't a genuine asylum seeker. I mean, he just didn't get it. So I think we've got to understand the distinction between what's going on the English Channel, and we have to find a way to stop the boats. I don't know if the Rwanda, I've been asked by media for the last 4 days, is this plan going to work? I don't know. I really don't know if this plan's going to work. And don't ask me about Rwanda. I'm not an expert on Rwanda. What I do think we need to do, though, is stop the migrant boats crossing the English Channel. And I'm not sure we can do that on our own. I think we're going to need help, preferably from the EU or from France, to see sense and say, why can we not have a safe third agreement with you, so that generally the message will be, if you try this, it won't work. You won't get into the UK and you won't get into the asylum system. But yes, absolutely. Let's look at what we can do and what we have done in places like Ukraine, Afghanistan, Hong Kong, Syria. There are some really good programs. But I think the world will not do that, not just the UK. The world will not do that when they're facing this huge challenge of irregular migration, because it's really hard politically to sell that. And that's what the Prime Minister said last Thursday. We can't have two tracks of asylum. We want to give genuine settlement to people who are in real need, like Ukrainians, but we can't also cover the second track, which is the crossing from France, which is a different route. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out now, because there's going to be a lot of opposition, there's going to be a lot of legal challenges. I don't know if we'll ever get past the courts on this, because there's a tension between the 51 conventions, human rights and asylum, refugee, and what we've tried to pass in law, and so it's going to be a real challenge. But for me, it's about beating the smugglers and stopping the boats and saving lives.
Oh, a couple more quick ones then. Lady there. Well, hang on a sec.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. Hi,
Just
Georgine
tell
Thorburn.
us name and rank.
Name and rank, number. So, Georgine Thorburn, freelance journalist. I just wanted to say that I really hope that the Home Office take you up on your offer for training, because I think they really need it, and I think you are fantastic and very, lively about the whole subject. So knowledgeable. You'd be so beneficial to them. I just wanted to mention that this, of course, has been done by Australia in the past, where in order to make it a fair, jumping the queue type immigration issue, where they had boats coming onto the northern shores of Australia, is they sent them to Christmas Island for appropriate processing. So people who were genuine got in, and people who weren't, who were financial migrants, were then sent back. And that seemed to be a very good policy of Australia, and that seems to be...
I thought it was more draconian than that. I thought they said anyone who comes in illegally will not get to Australia, even if they have a legitimate case.
Well, I think,
and I think
the majority of people would thoroughly agree with that approach.
Yeah.
And it was very popular.
It is true. I mean, as Tony was saying, I mean, public opinion kind of shifts around pretty dramatically on this. And overall, public opinion towards immigration has liberalised quite a lot, perhaps partly because of the end of free movement. The fact we do have, when it comes to mainstream sort of legal migration, we have control that we didn't have when we had free movement. So you've seen quite a sharp decline in the proportion of people who think that immigration is too high or far too high over the last couple of years. And I think the same thing would happen with asylum. I mean, if we had control over the system, I think you'd see people a much greater readiness, as in the Ukraine case, to actually take people. Some only temporarily, in a case like Ukraine. Some people more permanently. But
it's interesting to note about the Ukraine issue that there's up to 30% of the Ukraine refugees going into Poland who are recognised as financial migrants. So they're not even Ukrainian, but they are coming under that banner.
Yeah, I mean...
So how do you do it fairly? And that is, I think, to process people.
The reason why we were so much slower than most European countries is that European countries did not require visas. They've had an agreement since 2010 or 11, I think, that Ukrainians can have visa-free travel in the Schengen area. So they just, all they had to have was a passport. But so on the public opinion thing, I mean, there is still great hostility to the boats. I mean, it may have been reduced a little bit through sort of confusion with Ukraine, but I mean, I think more than 2/3 of people think that if you come in illegally to this country from a safe third country, you should not be allowed to claim asylum. That's more than 2/3 of the population believe that, which is basically saying they do not agree with the Geneva Convention right that anyone should be allowed to come here to claim asylum. Perhaps one last question.
Hi there, my name is Froy Legaspi from Citizens UK. Given the end of free movement and the necessary focus on what's happening with small boats, what does the panel think about if now is the right time to clear the desk and reset the system with undocumented migrants here in the UK? There are over the estimated several hundred thousands of undocumented migrants, and is it better served to spend resources on focusing on the increasing complexity of the current situation than dealing with migrants who've been here 5, 10 years who are settled?
Yeah, that's a good final question. What is the illegal immigrant population is? I mean, getting on for 1 million. Some people estimate it. I mean, it's growing by the day because of people who are coming in illegally, are not getting asylum, but are continuing to stay here. I think there are at least 300,000 people in that category alone. I mean, it is true. We have. I mean, it was a few years ago. I think we extended to. There used to be an amnesty once you'd been here 10 years, and that was extended, I think, under your favourite Home Secretary to 20 years. I mean, I think that probably is quite a good case, given human rights legislation, given that you're not going to chuck these people out anyway. You know, they can certainly claim, you know, the right to family life after even 2 years, let alone 10. So, I mean, you know, what do you think about that? Bring it down to 10 years.
Whatever you do, and we have had amnesties before. I can remember them actually. I'm that old. We did have an amnesty in the 70s for illegal entrance, but it was only for people that entered illegally. I don't know why, but it wasn't extended to overstays. So all the overstays pretend to be illegal entrants. And whatever you do, you're going to set a line on this, and you're going to set a bar on this. You're going to get people who are going to try and climb in under the bar and qualify for something they don't actually qualify for. So the first thing is you need to be very, very clear about how you are going to establish a criteria about who's in and who's out of this, and then you've got to be prepared to pay for the system, which will no doubt require a judicial review system and God knows how many appeal systems for those that fall foul of it. So a lot of work would need to be done on setting that up. As a matter of principle, I'm not opposed to that idea of clearing the slate, but I don't think you can clean the slate when you haven't got your house in order. And we don't have our house in order, do we? We've just been spending the last hour and a half talking about what a mess our house is in. So I think if we were able to say, yes, let's have a national identity register, let's stop the boats, let's get a plan for migration, which is properly controlled and managed, and then we can say to the communities, right now, look, we've got a grip now of everything. We know there are some very hard-working, innocent people who just happen to have fallen foul. Now, all please come forward and get yourself a biometric residence card or something. So we know who you are, and you can show to your employer or your landlord or your lawyer or anybody else that you're lawful. But I think there's an awful lot in the question. I mean, it's a good question, but I think there's an awful lot to unpack in it. I just think politically, at the moment, I just can't see it being...
It's also, I guess, one of those policies that you should just do rather than announce, because if you announce it, it becomes another magnet. It becomes another pull factor, doesn't it? You know, you can come here and you know, and you're legally illegal. Why wouldn't you? Any final thoughts, either of you, on any of the other questions we may not have responded to? Don't worry if you haven't. We've run over time anyway.
I just wanted to say there are some copies
of
my book available at the back, so if anyone would like me to sign a copy before we go, and then very welcome to...
Absolutely. Anyway, can we say thank you to Tony?